The Subcommittee on Environment and Oversight will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the Subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled The Renewable Fuel Standard, a 10-Year Review of Costs and Benefits. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to today's joint hearing of the Environment and Oversight Subcommittees, examining the Renewable Fuel Standard. Today we will hear from witnesses on the cost and environmental impact of this complex and misguided mandate, as well as the future consequences if Congress does not take action. The RFS is an example of the federal government picking winners and losers by forcing the use of renewables in transportation fuels. The mandate was supported by a bipartisan coalition, the ethanol industry, and environmental organizations, and justified by claims of environmental benefits and enhanced U.S. energy security. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, 8 years after the current RFS was expanded by Congress as part of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, these promises have yet to materialize. Congress designed the RFS using flawed projections about gasoline consumption, availability of renewable fuel infrastructure, biorefinery technology, and the market demand for renewable fuels. In almost every category, these projections do not reflect today's energy market. Today, demand for gasoline is significantly lower than was forecast when the RFS became law. A sluggish economy and improvements in vehicle energy efficiency continue to hold down gasoline consumption. And technology advancements have unlocked our domestic resources of oil and gas to an extent that was not anticipated when the RFS was designed. Incorporating renewable fuels was supposed to deliver environmental benefits. But time and again, researchers, including one of our witnesses today, have found that corn ethanol produced to meet the RFS makes air quality worse and has higher life cycle emissions than gasoline. And while corn-based fuel ethanol production, supported by the requirements of this standard, has grown substantially since ISA became law, the advanced biofuels and cellulosic ethanol industries expected under the RFS still aren't ready for prime time. The RFS is an egregious perversion of the free market. Instead of a transportation fuel market driven by consumer demand, we are stuck with a complex mandate based on outdated assumptions about gasoline demand, environmental impact, and technological readiness. Each year, the RFS requires still higher volumes of renewable fuel, which now exceed the volumes that can be accommodated given current gasoline demand. The RFS mandate is unworkable, and even with the EPA's dubious assertions that E15 can safely be used in select vehicles, even though most vehicles were designed to use E10, gasoline containing not more than 10% ethanol. This is on top of the simple fact that consumers do not want these fuels. Just 0.5% of what Holly Frontier, a merchant refiner with facilities in my district, sells are products greater than E10, 0.5%. And because the ethanol blending volumes required under law are impossible to meet with the current production levels of E10, E15, and other higher level ethanol blends, including E85, refiners are left at the mercy of uncertain annual waivers from the EPA. I'm going to repeat that. Refiners are left at the mercy of uncertain annual waivers from the EPA to keep the mandatory blending volumes at achievable levels. When EPA even bothers to follow the law and announce annual requirements, and that is when EPA bothers to follow the law and announce annual requirements on time. Refiners have had to file lawsuits to get the EPA to do their job and announce the annual blend levels, which is absurd. Congress cannot continue to sit back and leave the EPA to manage the consequences of an unrealistic and poorly crafted law. So what is the end result of this confusing mandate? American consumers are stuck with higher prices across the economy. The mandate has already increased prices at the pump, and if the RFS is enforced as enacted, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that E10 fuel prices could increase by 15% or more by 2017. By increasing demand for corn, the RFS also distorts commodity prices, raising the cost of food for American families. We will hear testimony that the RFS cost the chain restaurant industry $3.2 billion a year in higher food prices, which must be passed on to consumers, our constituents. The federal government's RFS mandate has led to multiple negative consequences propelled by willful disregard for consumer preferences and flawed economic and environmental assumptions. Demand for fuels with blends of ethanol greater than E10 is very limited, even with the most favorable market conditions. And more corn ethanol hasn't helped the environment. It hasn't reduced costs or encouraged the development of commercial-scale advanced biofuels. Federal mandates are the wrong approach to fuel innovation, and the RFS is a prime example of the elites in Washington, D.C. believing they know best, imposing a misguided standard, then standing back while it damages our economy. I want to thank our witnesses today for testifying on the challenges of the RFS, testifying on the challenges the RFS has created in today's energy market, and I look forward to a discussion about the consequences caused by the federal government's intervention in the American energy market. It's time for Congress to fix the problems caused by this outdated and ill-conceived law and pass legislation to repeal the RFS. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Oregon, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today to discuss the history and future of the Renewable Fuel Standard. In 2005, Congress established the Renewable Fuel Standard as a way to both reduce our dependence on foreign oil and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The RFS policy also had the added benefit of advancing rural economic development. In 2007, Congress expanded the RFS to drive additional innovation and investment in the biofuels industry. And now, 10 years later, the original goals and motivation for the Renewable Fuel Standard still remain valid. Despite this fact, we will hear today from some who will assert that the RFS is a failed policy and that it should be repealed. I respectfully disagree. Our nation's long-term economic and energy security is tied to our ability to diversify our energy portfolio and to transition to lower carbon energy sources. Biofuels have an important part to play in this energy future. It would be better if we were further along, but the Renewable Fuel Standard has been and should continue to be a critical mechanism for fostering the development of this emerging industry. In my home state of Oregon, we've recognized the significant opportunities in biofuels, especially with our state's strong agriculture and forestry industries. For example, Red Rock Biofuels is investing about $200 million to build a biorefinery facility in southern Oregon, where they will transform waste biomass from forests and sawmills into jet fuel. Now, that's a place that really needs the jobs down there in southern Oregon. Red Rock plans to sell 6 million gallons of its renewable jet fuel each year to Southwest Airlines and FedEx Express. This type of innovation will greatly reduce the carbon footprint of our airlines and create jobs in an area that needs them. Additionally, in my congressional district, Summit Natural Energy converts food processing and agricultural wastes into bioethanol for race cars. And I've spoken with the race car drivers. They rave about this product. The potential of biofuels, especially advanced biofuels, in addressing climate change is real, and it is something that we should be encouraging, not trying to undermine. Reducing carbon pollution from the transportation sector is critical in our fight against climate change, and the economic costs of not acting are catastrophic. In fact, a recent report by Citigroup GPS shows that the cost of climate inaction could be up to $44 trillion by 2060. We need to use a variety of mechanisms to curb greenhouse gases, and the RFS is one of these tools. Most recent estimates of the Argonne National Laboratory's GREET, the Greenhouse Gases Regulated Emissions and Energy Use in Transportation model, have shown that corn ethanol can produce up to 48% less greenhouse gases than gasoline across the entire life cycle. Investments in first-generation biofuels are serving as an important bridge to the development of advanced biofuels, including cellulosic biofuels. Just last week, DuPont opened the world's largest cellulosic ethanol plant in Iowa. If done correctly, in a sustainable and thoughtful manner, we can produce biofuels that will lower carbon emissions of our transportation sector. A viable, competitive, advanced biofuels industry relies on the infrastructure developed for the first-generation conventional biofuels. The RFS was designed to provide market certainty to drive the production of domestically produced biofuels. We have seen what an industry can do when given a strong market signal, a signal that the RFS can provide. Over-reliance on a limited range of technologies and finite resources is unreasonable. Our nation cannot drill our way to energy security and a thriving economy. We must continue to take steps to mitigate climate change. We need to unleash the creativity of our scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs, and the renewable fuel standard is an important tool in spurring innovation and unlocking our energy potential. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I'd like to thank the ranking member. I now recognize the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Mr. Loudermilk, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and witnesses for being here with us today. I'd like to thank you for taking your time to come here and discuss this extremely important matter that we're facing. Today, we're here to examine the big picture challenge of the renewable fuel standard and its impact on our country and the American people. 10 years ago, supporters of the RFS promised to put our country on a path to being cleaner, greener, and more energy independent in a time of heavy dependence on foreign oil and high gas prices. Back then, gasoline consumption was on the rise. America relied on foreign oil, and renewable fuels were just starting to become an option for consumers. Fast forward to today, where the demand for gasoline is decreasing. Our country is now considering exporting crude oil, and we know that ethanol and biofuels are not as clean as we once thought. In the committee's hearing on the RFS this summer, we heard testimony from Dr. Jason Hill from the University of Minnesota, who debunked the misnomer that corn ethanol is cleaner than regular gasoline. Dr. Hill acknowledged that while ethanol fuels generally burn cleaner than gasoline at the tailpipe, if you look at the life cycle emissions of ethanol, you can see that the process of growing and fermenting grain and distilling, distributing, and combusting out ethanol releases far more of the 5 particulate pollutants that contribute to increased particulate matter 2.5 and ozone levels than gasoline. In short, corn-based ethanol is simply not cleaner than gasoline. Dr. DeCicco, who joins us here today, has conducted careful analysis of more than 100 related studies, concluding that serious flaws exist in the government-sponsored modeling used to justify the RFS. It comes as no surprise that the Office of Inspector General for the EPA announced this month that they are planning to investigate whether the EPA complied with the reporting requirements associated with the RFS. The IG will also be examining whether the EPA appropriately updated the life cycle analysis supporting the RFS with findings from studies mandated in the statute on the environmental impacts of biofuels. And we look forward to their findings. It is also clear that the demand today for biofuels is far less than the EPA anticipated it would be. In our last hearing, we heard from Country Mark, a farmer-owned integrated oil company that sells E10, E15, and E85 fuel at its stations. This farmer-owned small business refiner cannot sell E85 to the very farmers who grow the corn used for the ethanol it's blended because there is no demand for this fuel. It is also becoming clear that Americans are ill-equipped to make smart decisions about gasoline choices entering the marketplace. According to a recent study conducted by the Outdoor Power Equipment Institute, Americans choose to purchase gasoline based on price and simply don't pay attention to the warning labels placed at the pump. This results in consumers using fuels with higher blends of ethanol in lawnmowers, chainsaws, generators, and other small engine equipment that are not certified to use those fuels. This can cause damage or permanently destroy those products. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record a letter from Todd Teskey, President of Briggs & Stratton, which outlines these points in further detail.
Without objection, so ordered.
Finally, I want to thank our witnesses today for testifying on the impact that the RFS has on the American people. It's time for Congress to make a change. When existing law is unworkable, Congress must listen to experts and adjust the law as it is needed. I hope this hearing will bring to light some of the unintended consequences of the RFS and provide guidance to lawmakers as we decide the future of this law. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Loudermilk. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Mr. Byer, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Chairman Bridenstine and Loudermilk, for holding today's hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for testifying. The greatest challenge of this generation, climate change, requires innovative solutions if we ever hope to make a meaningful difference. It requires us to look at every aspect of our energy production and consumption. We must find ways to end our dependence on fossil fuels and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The Renewable Fuel Standard has helped us push the technological limits and the capacity of industry to innovate our transportation fuels. In the past 10 years, we've seen increasing production of biofuels from both corn ethanol and advanced biofuels. And this increase has come with considerable advancements in how corn ethanol is produced, improving production efficiencies, while decreasing both the costs and the greenhouse gas emissions. The Renewable Fuel Standard was designed to integrate all biofuels into our fuel supply and lay the groundwork for the growth and development of an advanced biofuels with at least a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to that of conventional gasoline. And I'm interested in learning more about the advancements in this area and where we can expect biofuels to be in the next 10 years. We realize there have been challenges. The EPA is prepared to finalize the volumetric requirements for 2014, 2015, 2016 next month, while missing, or later this month, after missing the statutory deadline 2 years in a row. And while they're inundated with public comments during the proposal process, that doesn't excuse the lengthy delay. The agency has issued waivers for the required cellulosic biofuels and plans to do so again, but I hope that the proposed volumetric obligations can be finalized by November 30th deadline to provide market certainty and signals to investors that the U.S. intends to be a world leader in the development and production of these advanced fuels. Look, with a wide-ranging body of research looking at every aspect of production and a range of stakeholders that have advocated for almost every different scenario available, we as lawmakers are left with difficult decisions to make. And I want to thank the witnesses again for providing expert testimony on this pressing topic. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. Let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Dr. Terry Dinan, Senior Advisor at the Congressional Budget Office. Dr. Dinan received her bachelor's degree from John Carroll University and her PhD in economics from Iowa State University. Our next witness is Mr. Ed Anderson, President and CEO of WEN-GAP LLC. Mr. Anderson received his bachelor's degree from Guilford College and currently owns 11 Wendy's franchises. Our third witness today is Dr. John DeCicco, Research Professor at the University of Michigan Energy Institute. Dr. DeCicco received his bachelor's degree in mathematics from Catholic University, his master's degree in mechanical engineering from North Carolina State University, and his PhD in mechanical engineering from Princeton University. Our fourth witness today is Mr. Brooke Coleman, Executive Director of the Advanced Biofuels Business Council. Mr. Coleman received his bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University and his law degree from Northeastern. Our final witness today is Mr. Charles Drevna, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Institute for Energy Research. Mr. Drevna has over 40 years of extensive experience in legislative, regulatory, public policy, and marketplace issues involving energy and the environment. Prior to joining IER, he served as president of the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. Mr. Drevna received his bachelor's degree in chemistry from Washington and Jefferson College. I now recognize Dr. Dinan for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Bridenstine, Chairman Loudermilk, Ranking Member Bonamici, Ranking Member Byer, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the Renewable Fuel Standard. This testimony updates the Congressional Budget Office's report on the RFS, which was published in June 2014. The RFS establishes minimum volumes of various types of renewable fuels that suppliers must blend into the U.S. transportation fuel supply. Those volumes, as defined by the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, or ISA, are intended to grow each year through 2022. To date, the requirements of the RFS have been met largely by blending gasoline with ethanol made from cornstarch. In the future, ISA requires the use of increasingly large amounts of advanced biofuels, which include diesel made from biomass, ethanol made from sugarcane, and cellulosic biofuels. CBO concludes that the rising requirements of ISA would be very hard to meet in the future because of two main obstacles. First, making cellulosic biofuels is complex and costly. Second, the increasing requirement for the total gallons of renewable fuels would push the average concentration of ethanol and gasoline to well above 10%, the maximum concentration that is feasible in order to avoid corrosion damage in older vehicles. Because of those challenges, EPA has been scaling back the requirements of ISA. That strategy decreases compliance cost in the short run, but it also reduces incentives for companies to invest in the production capacity for advanced biofuels and to expand the availability of high ethanol blends. CBO also examined how prices for food and fuel would vary in an illustrative year, 2017, based on 3 scenarios. The first, the 2016 volume scenario, is one in which the EPA would keep the RFS requirements for 2017 at the same amounts it has proposed for 2016. The second, the isovolume scenario, is one in which fuel suppliers would have to meet the total requirements for renewable fuels and for advanced fuels, biofuels that are stated in ISA for 2017, but not the requirement for cellulosic biofuels. The final scenario is one in which lawmakers would immediately abolish the RFS. CBO found that food prices would be similar under the 3 scenarios. To the extent that the RFS increased the demand for corn ethanol, it would raise corn prices and put upward pressure on prices of foods made with corn. Under the ISA volume scenario, CBO estimated under the isovolume scenario, CBO estimated that the resulting increase in the demand for corn would raise the average price of corn by about 3% relative to the 2016 volume scenario. However, because corn and food made with corn account for only a small fraction of total U.S. spending on food, that total spending would only increase by about 0.1%. The effect that repealing the RFS would have on the price of corn is limited because suppliers would probably find it cost-effective to use a roughly 10% blend of corn ethanol and gasoline in 2017, even in the absence of the RFS. As a result, CBO estimates that, in comparison with the 2016 volume scenario, repealing the RFS would cause food prices to fall by less than 0.1%. In contrast, CBO found that the prices of transportation fuels would vary significantly under the 3 scenarios. Compared with the 2016 volume scenario, we found that complying with the ISA volume scenario would increase the price of petroleum-based diesel by 25 cents to 45 cents per gallon. We also estimated that the price of E10, a blend of fuel that contains up to 10% ethanol and which is currently the most commonly used transportation fuel in the United States, would rise by 15 cents to 30 cents. CBO found that complying with the ISA volume scenario would reduce the price of E85, a blend containing up to 85% ethanol, by roughly 80 cents to $1.20. Finally, compared with the 2016 volume scenario, CBO estimates that repealing the RFS would have only small effects on fuel prices. Specifically, we estimate that repealing the RFS would have essentially no effect on the 2017 price of E10, would lower the price of petroleum-based diesel by roughly 5 cents, and would increase the price of E85 by about 15 cents. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have on CBO's analysis.
Thank you, Dr. Dinan. I now recognize Mr. Anderson for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Bridenstine, Chairman Loudermilk, ranking members Bonamici and Byer, and members of the subcommittees. My name is Ed Anderson. My wife Judy and I, with our sons Eddie and Jeff, own a small Wendy's franchise with 11 restaurants in Virginia. We have 385 employees. I am also on the board of Wendy's Quality Supply Chain Co-op, QSCC, a not-for-profit purchasing co-op owned by Wendy's restaurant operators like me. QSCC purchases the food for Wendy's and is staffed by experts who understand and help us interpret commodity markets. The National Council of Chain Restaurants asked me to testify on behalf of the local small business chain restaurant community. In July 2013, I testified at a similar hearing on the RFS before the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Until then, I had never done anything like this and never imagined that I would. I run restaurants, but I have a responsibility to my family, employees, fellow franchisees, customers, and our industry to explain to policymakers that the well-intended RFS has turned out to be a very serious problem. Judy and I are the face of American small business men and women. We've worked for decades to build our business. But when Congress passed the Renewable Fuel Standard, it created a new burden for businesses like ours. Now restaurant owners and employers like us are being hurt at a time when our country can't afford it. The last time I was here, I doubted many restaurant operators, let alone our customers, knew that a federal government mandate called the RFS, it is at the root of food cost increases. But more and more of us in the food business understand the RFS is a big mistake, and the average consumer is starting to catch on too. There have been several studies of the RFS impact on food commodity volatility and costs. A study from PricewaterhouseCoopers in late 2012 found that the RFS is costing the chain restaurant segment of the restaurant industry, which is a segment I and thousands of small business franchisees are in, up to $3.2 billion in higher food commodity costs every year. My own analysis is that the RFS is costing my small company up to $34,000 more in higher food costs per restaurant each and every year. For our family, that's up to $374,000 a year in additional costs. That might not be a lot of money in Washington, D.C., but for me and many others in the restaurant business, that's a lot of money. If Congress repealed the RFS, it would level the playing field and over time return normalcy to the commodities market so everyone competes fairly and food becomes more affordable. It's the RFS that distorts the market so much that restaurants, our suppliers, and consumers are forced to pay more than we would under normal market conditions. Please understand, we're not anti-ethanol. We know if it wasn't for American farmers and ranchers, we wouldn't be here. We get all our beef and chicken from the U.S. and Canada. But this mandate is making food so expensive that it's harder to continue investing in new or remodeled restaurants, which would create badly needed construction and restaurant jobs. I believe with all my heart that we live in the greatest country in the world. It was built on the hard work and the ingenuity of those willing to risk it all to build something, creating jobs and opportunity for others along the way. Removing the mandate for ethanol allows that industry to stand on its own, like Judy and I do, like our sons who work for us do. Capitalism allows us all to adjust and be successful. Let the market, not a mandate, dictate the cost of corn. We can't pass these costs on to our customers. They're already struggling in this economy, and their own food costs at grocery stores have also gone up because of the RFS. We're appealing to Congress to provide relief from this policy which distorts food commodity markets and harms consumers and everyone in the food chain. Congress created the RFS, so it's up to Congress to repeal it. Thoughtful lawmakers in both the House and Senate introduced legislation to repeal or significantly reform the RFS. H.R. 703 and 704 would repeal the entire RFS or repeal the worst part of it, the corn ethanol mandate. Both bills enjoy growing bipartisan support. The RFS was a big mistake, and it's broken beyond repair. We came here today to respectfully ask Congress to repeal it. Judy and I are here as small business owners, as employers, and as a family to bring attention to the realized impact the RFS has had and to ask Congress to take action for all of us, because without your action, this situation will only get worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Dr. DeCicco, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I wish to thank the chairman.
Could you turn on your microphone?
Yes. I wish to thank the chairman and ranking members, as well as other members of the subcommittee and full committee, for inviting me to today's hearing. My name's John DeCicco, and I hold a doctorate in engineering from Princeton. Before joining the University of Michigan faculty in 2009, I worked professionally on energy issues since 1977, including 21 years at major environmental organizations. However, the findings I'm presenting today are my own professional views as an independent academic and do not reflect those of the University of Michigan, my past affiliations, or funders. My research shows that the Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS, has been harmful to the environment from its inception. Now, 10 years after the 2005 Energy Policy Act, the program has resulted in higher CO2 emissions than would have otherwise occurred. It also harms the environment in other ways. Sadly, the adverse impacts of the RFS have grown worse since it was expanded by the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. The notion that renewable fuels readily reduce CO2 is based on a scientifically incorrect understanding of carbon neutrality. Only under certain conditions does substituting a biofuel for a fossil fuel neutralize the CO2, leaving a tailpipe. For that to occur, harvesting the feedstock must significantly increase how rapidly cropland absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere on a net basis. That condition is not met for corn ethanol mandated by the RFS. It might be satisfied for cellulosic feedstocks, but once properly evaluated, the gains may not be as great as advocates assume. The life cycle models used to calculate fuel carbon footprints, including EPA's RFS model and the DOE-sponsored GREET model, automatically credit all biofuels with complete carbon neutrality without checking whether that assumption is valid. My studies, which rely on crop data instead of computer modeling, find that the carbon neutrality condition is not being met. We evaluated corn ethanol, for which life cycle analysis claimed a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to gasoline. But examining data for the croplands actually supplying the facility finds no significant reduction in emissions. Under some circumstances, the emissions could be as much as 70% higher than those of gasoline. And these results do not even include the indirect land use change, which would increase biofuel-related emissions even more. The key problem is that diverting harvest from existing productive land does not remove more carbon from the air than was already being removed from during prior crop growth. All it does is shuffle carbon around. In effect, it robs Peter to pay Paul. Our ongoing research involves a detailed carbon balance analysis of U.S. renewable fuel production since 2005. Preliminary results show that no significant direct CO2 reduction can be claimed for the RFS. Once indirect land use change is considered, the result is substantially higher CO2 emissions overall. Excess CO2 is not the only environmental harm caused by this policy. Fellow University of Michigan researchers have documented how ethanol production has destroyed habitat for waterfowl and other wildlife. Expanding corn ethanol production is worsening water pollution, contributing to algae blooms in the Gulf of Mexico and Lake Erie. And as for other air pollution, recent research found that the country's third largest corn ethanol refinery emits 30 times more air pollution than was assumed for the RFS regulatory analysis. Ethanol's corrosive properties are also incompatible with cars already on the road and degrade the operation of lawnmowers, motorboats, and other gasoline-powered equipment used by homeowners and businesses alike. In summary, a careful look at the data shows that the studies used to justify the RFS were flawed. Scientifically speaking, life cycle analysis is an inappropriate method for specifying public policy. Inserting life cycle requirements into the law has proven to be a mistake. Only a direct, year-at-a-time accounting provides a scientifically sound way to evaluate the CO2 impact of fuels. Once that is done, it is clear that the production and use of biofuels, as mandated by the RFS, has increased CO2 emissions to date. Thank you again for allowing me to share my findings, and I'll look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. DeCicco. Mr. Coleman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Bridenstine, Chairman Loudermilk, Ranking Members Bonamici and Beyer, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Brooke Coleman. I run something called the Advanced Biofuels Business Council. The council represents worldwide leaders in the effort to develop and commercialize next-generation advanced and cellulosic biofuels, ranging from cellulosic ethanol made from switchgrass, wood chips, and agricultural waste to advanced biofuels made from sustainable energy crops, municipal solid waste, and algae. We are honored to be here today to help accurately assess the impacts of the federal renewable fuel standard When I was thinking about my testimony today, it was quite clear that I would be giving a counter perspective, and I want to give it. The RFS, in my opinion, is one of the most effective energy policies ever passed by Congress. Its notoriety stems not from its failures and unforeseen costs, as alleged, but instead its effectiveness in breaking the oil monopoly that leaves our economy and our environment at risk. So if we're going to assess the RFS from a 10-year perspective, let's look a little bit back at where we were 10 years ago. We were in the middle of an MTBE crisis where the oil industry used a gasoline additive to avoid ethanol that polluted drinking water. The political deal, in essence, that happened on RFS 1 was a way to facilitate getting MTBE out of gasoline and out of our families' drinking water. And it happened in less than a year because Congress sent a clear market signal that ethanol, a homegrown American renewable product, would replace MTBE in the marketplace. A couple years later, Congress decided to pass a stronger RFS. And RFS 2, passed in December 2007, builds upon those successes. It now supports more than 800,000 American jobs in 29 states producing homegrown renewable fuels as an alternative to foreign oil. This industry now displaces the foreign oil equivalent almost of Saudi Arabia and approximately Ecuador. And now we are innovating. I just returned from Nevada, Iowa, where DuPont just opened the largest cellulosic ethanol plant in the world. The plant will produce biofuel from corn stover, the unused part of the corn plant, collected from local farms within 100 miles of the facility. Quad County Syngenta was one of the first, if not the first, to produce commercial volumes of cellulosic biofuels. Their Celerate technology produces cellulosic ethanol that is 129% better than gasoline on carbon emissions, reduces energy inputs, and increases the quality and quantity of production co-products like corn oil and cattle feed. Abengoa and Poet DSM are deploying similar technologies, using agricultural waste to make the lowest carbon, most innovative fuel in the world. One more example, a member of mine, Fulcrum Bioenergy, just signed a $60 million deal with United Airlines to make intermediate biocrude and biojet. Unfortunately, the program's clear record of success is often lost in the cloud of misinformation kicked up by the oil industry and the so-called researchers, fellows, and experts funded by them. Just as the oil industry has been able to finance doubt about climate change, they are doing a heck of a job financing doubt about their primary competitor in biofuels. I want to touch on a couple of these examples, and I hope that we can touch on some of the reports and positions that we have mentioned during Q&A. The first is this notion that we are in a free market. It has been mentioned, it was mentioned by the chairman, it was mentioned by multiple experts up here today. This is not a free market. The oil markets are controlled at the top by OPEC. They are controlled here in the United States by vertically integrated, highly consolidated oil companies. We need the RFS because we can't get shelf space. We have to sell to our primary competitors who want to see us fail in order to gain market access. The problem is we are experiencing what it is like to be in a market-controlled environment as we speak. We don't have low gasoline prices because we have efficiency. We don't have low gasoline prices because suddenly our economy is doing something different. We have low gasoline prices because OPEC made a decision 1 year ago to drive down the price of fuel to put the US oil boom on its heels and to kill oil rig counts in this country. So OPEC is killing the very thing that the oil industry says is the reason we don't need the RFS anymore. In essence, the RFS is a hedge against this market power and allows our industry to grow and innovate over time with an expectation of market. If you give us a true free market, we will give you the RFS. Finally, with my last 25 seconds, I'd like to say one of the most incredible arguments made against us is the food price argument. I have compassion, of course, for franchise owners, but the problem is that corn prices today are lower than they were when President Bush signed this law in 2007. It is hard for me to believe that the RFS is increasing food costs when the primary reason that the restaurants claim, while they pull in record profits over the last 10 years, this year, is that corn prices are increasing when they're actually decreasing. So one of the things I would like to do and have the opportunity to do as we move forward in Q&A is discuss some of these issues, and I look forward to that very much. But I am confident that the facts will prevail in the RFS discussion. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Mr. Drevna, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Bridenstine and Loudermilk, ranking members Bonamici and Byer. I am Charlie Drevna, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Energy Research. You know, once Milton Friedman famously posited that one of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. If he were alive today, Friedman would point to the RFS as a prime example of his belief. In the mid-2000s and even before, so-called industry analysts and renowned economists predicted ever-increasing gasoline demand as they simultaneously declared the U.S. to be energy scarce. The nation was on a path, according to these self-anointed experts, to reliance on ever-increasing foreign sources of energy, much of which came from potentially unstable regions of the world. Congress and the administration accepted their views and in 2005 adopted the Energy Policy Act, which required refiners to blend 7.5 billion gallons of ethanol into the gasoline pool by 2012. In less than 2 years, this nuisance of free market interference became a full-blown anti-consumer, anti-free market debacle, as ESA 07 mandated 36 billion gallons of renewable fuels, some of which actually existed, be blended into domestic transportation fuels by 2022. In essence, the predictions of 2007 and earlier are the polar opposite of the realities of 2015. Compounding the problem is the undeniable fact that advanced biofuels production, the anticipated linchpin of the RFS, has fallen woefully short of the numerous promises made since 2007. I'm sure the committee is familiar with such names as Range Fuels, Keyor, Blue Sugars, Absolute Fuels, New Energy Fuels, Green Diesel, and a host of others, most of whom have squandered taxpayer dollars or committed fraud, or both. And yet today, we continue to hear that the economic production of cellulosic fuels is right around the corner. It's a big corner. What's clear is that neither Congress nor EPA can mandate innovation or favorable economics, try as they may. The hard sciences of chemistry and physics remain immune to political science, and they remain formidable obstacles to economic production of commercial-scale cellulosic fuels. However, one should not discount the innovation provided by EPA to assist in this effort. EPA stipulates that ethanol produced from sugarcane qualifies as an advanced biofuel, thus helping to meet the statutory volume requirements. What's ironic about this muse is that ethanol produced from sugarcane is imported, mostly from Brazil. So much for that homegrown stuff. What was the intent of the RFS to limit imported fuels? Okay. So which state virtually imports all this biofuel? Well, that would be California. And why California? The state's low-carbon fuel standard requires refiners to use millions of gallons of advanced biofuel, and imported sugarcane is the only available product that fits that definition, as unscientific as that definition is. Yes, that's correct. California prohibits ethanol from U.S. producers and imports it from Brazil. This allows California legislators and regulators to promote themselves as pioneers in the green movement. So what happens to the ethanol from the U.S. producers that would have otherwise been delivered to California? The Brazilians don't care if their ethanol comes from sugar or corn, so California and Brazil swap their ethanol, literally 2 ships passing in the night. The net outcome? Higher shipping costs and, ironically, increases in GHG emissions. Not satisfied with the overall results, EPA then decided to enhance the total production of cellulosic fuels, not via scientific breakthrough. Rather, it would be much simpler to change the definition of cellulosic fuels to include a portion of biogas produced from landfills. If you look at the volume increases in cellulosic production 2014 through 15, it's nearly all attributable to EPA semantics. Why let a pesky little detail such as chemical structure and definition get in the way of a predetermined outcome? If one were to be intellectually honest, the RFS was never about energy security, the environment, or national security. It's been accurately described as crony capitalism, although the use of the term capitalism in reference to the RFS is a basic non sequitur. It may be much more accurate to label the RFS and other anti-free market mandates, subsidies, and giveaways for what they really are: government attempting to pick winners and losers in the marketplace. and the government's track record is most illustrative, as its penchant for picking losers is quite outstanding. Even if the intentions of the RFS were noble, the program must be judged on its results. It's past time for Congress to admit that the RFS has not delivered and will not deliver the anticipated results. The law should be repealed and allow for American ingenuity, entrepreneurship, and free market enterprise to do what it does best. They haven't failed the nation yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Drevna. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. I just wanted to go back for a second to Dr. DeCicco, looking at your bio. Research professor at the University of Michigan Energy Institute, bachelor's degree in mathematics from Catholic University, master's degree in mechanical engineering from North Carolina State University, PhD in mechanical engineering from Princeton University. You've been involved in research on energy and environment issues for a long time. Correct me if I'm wrong, you worked for the Environmental Defense Fund, is that correct?
That's right, for 9 years.
Would you be characterized as a conservative witness in general? Would you characterize yourself as that, or somebody that's a hack for the oil industry, or anything like that?
I certainly would not.
Reading your bio and looking at your background, I think that is fairly safe to assume. In fact, when I read your bio, I was a little bit interested in why Republicans were bringing you to testify. But hearing your testimony, being somebody who's very concerned about the environment, somebody who's very concerned about carbon emissions, your testimony today, I heard you say 70% higher carbon emissions in some circumstances because of the renewable fuel standard. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
How do you get to 70% higher with the renewable fuel standard? Can you share with us how that happens?
Sure. The thing to keep in mind is that all of the claims for reduction on biofuels depend on this carbon neutrality assumption. When that's not met, you start with essentially a wash when you're comparing, say, ethanol to gasoline or biodiesel to petroleum diesel. And then you have to look at the process emissions from that basis. And it's not nearly as efficient to process corn ethanol from biomass as it is to process gasoline from petroleum. In fact, from a carbon efficiency point of view, basic chemistry tells us that when you ferment a fuel, and this goes for any fermented-based ethanol, whether it comes from a cellulosic feedstock or starch like corn or sugarcane, for every molecule of ethanol that you produce, 1 molecule of CO2 gets produced as beer bubbles. We know when you ferment, you have a frothy thing, creates CO2. So if you can no longer assume that that's free CO2, free carbon in that fuel, which is false by my analysis of cropland data, then right there, you lose a lot of carbon back to the atmosphere during processing. So when you add that back in, when you add in the emissions to make fertilizer, when you add in the emissions to run the biorefineries even from natural gas in a dry mill, which is a pretty efficient form of biorefinery, and take away this automatic credit that the life cycle models assume, you can end up with 70% higher emissions. And that's not the end of the story. I mean, that's not the upper limit on the damage when you begin to look at the ripple effects.
So in your testimony, I have heard you mentioned harmful to the environment. I just heard you use the word damage to the environment, higher CO2 emissions, in some cases 70% higher. You mentioned water pollution. You mentioned algae bloom. Did you mention, I think yesterday when I talked to you, you mentioned deforestation. Can you talk to that for a second?
Sure. When you divert crops from the food and feed market, and what's going on in the country now, around 40% of our corn harvest is going into ethanol production. Now, some of that comes back as co-product, but it nets out to about 30%. Well, does that mean people are eating 30% less food or that we're having 30% less cattle? No. We have a global commodity market, and what happens is that when grains are diverted into the fuel market, that grain that would otherwise be used for food has to get made up somewhere else. And if you trace that, as a number of scientific analyses have done in the past several years, and look at the ripple effect, the loss of grain from American fields due to the biofuel mandate results, for example, in additional deforestation in Brazil and sub-Saharan Africa as the food markets try to compensate and have to put more land into production. This is a highly uncertain effect, but there's no doubt, because of the coupling of global commodity markets, that this effect, which is known as indirect land use change, is occurring.
Thank you, Dr. DeCicco. I'm out of time, but it is important to note that if it's damaging to the environment, if it's putting more CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, if it's adding to prices for both food and fuel, it leaves us wondering what are the reasons that we still have the renewable fuel standard. I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Ms. Bonamici, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and what an interesting discussion this morning. Really appreciate the conversation. Mr. Coleman, in his testimony, Dr. DeCicco states that the RFS has been harmful to the environment. I'm following up on the chairman's question, and that only under limited conditions does substituting a biofuel for a fossil fuel neutralize tailpipe CO2 emissions. Now, it's my understanding that a number of analysis, including from the U.S. Department of Energy, indicate that most biofuels do reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we're getting ready for the climate change conference in Paris, and we need to do more, not less, to mitigate climate change. So scientists at the Argonne National Laboratory, Purdue University, and the Federal Aviation Administration have responded to some of the criticisms Dr. DeCicco has raised in writing regarding the ability of biofuels to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this paper into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, one of the conclusions reached in this paper is that Dr. DeCicco does not take into account the carbon emissions that are avoided when a biofuel displaces the use of fossil fuels. This displacement seems fairly important. So can you please respond to the assertion that the RFS does not reduce carbon emissions and that it's broadly caused more harm than good for the environment, particularly focusing on the need to consider displacement of fossil fuels? And I do want to save time for another question.
Sure, I'll go quickly. So we obviously don't agree with Dr. DeCicco, but I think it's important to understand who doesn't agree with him. It's EPA, the Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the national labs in Oak Ridge and Argonne National Laboratory, the California Air Resources Board, which is hardly pro-biofuels. What Dr. DeCicco does is he actually does something that's quite provocative in the carbon accounting world. So it may be different and might get you attention, but it's not well supported, and it's called additionality. So he doesn't really, when you grow a plant, whether it's corn or switchgrass or whatever, it absorbs sunlight and CO2 while it's growing, and that's one of the benefits of using bioenergy. Instead of having a solar panel to absorb the sunlight, you're transferring it into gasoline. He wants to take that credit away under the assumption that the farmer would have done it anyway. And the problem with doing that is it removes the whole notion of supply chain emissions, and you can't account for it. So if you have a state or you want to put solar panels on your roof and you have the government saying, oh, well, sorry, Ms. Bonamici, you would have done that anyway, so we're not going to give you credit to do that, it suspends reality with regard to carbon accounting, and that's why responsible regulatory agents don't do it that way. It's an interesting academic exercise. So I think we have to rely on the body of the evidence to support what's going on in this space, and biofuels are carbon reductive.
Thank you. And then I have a two-part question. There's been some criticism of the EPA on its implementation of the RFS. Some of it is certainly well-placed. The EPA's delayed the release of the volumetric obligations for the past couple of years, and I want to note that the proposed volumetric obligations to be finalized this month were actually proposed in part in 2013. The agency received more than 340,000 comments on the proposed rule that year, and evaluation of the comments led to a delay. It's unfortunate, but I still don't think that it's acceptable that the program has experienced such delays. And I want you to discuss how that has affected the biofuels industry. Do you agree that the consecutive delays have hurt investments in the industry and innovative technology and development? And then I also want you to talk about, we've had a lot of conversations here about corn, but obviously based on the work that your organization does. There's so much potential out there in this second generation. So if the RFS is repealed, as some are suggesting, what would that do to the advancement of all the alternative second generation biofuels, and particularly all the small businesses and businesses across the country that are working to innovate and come up with new alternatives?
Right. Well, I appreciate the question. I spoke to this a little bit when I talked about the market. So we need policy because the market isn't free. And so when the policy is suspended or not enacted, we're in a tough situation because we don't know if the oil companies are going to buy our product. And if we don't know if the oil companies are going to buy our product, it's pretty hard to get financing to build those projects. And so what happened in 2013, and has happened for 2 years, is a failure to finalize the rule is basically suspended investment in advanced biofuels. And we are confident that we can get back on track. The courts have actually required EPA to get the final rule out by November 30th of this year. The key, however, will be that EPA gets a good rule out and not just a timely rule out. And so while we expect the timeliness problem to be fixed, EPA is also still proposing to have a waiver, a new waiver in there that would allow the program to be waived if the oil companies fail to distribute our fuel. And the whole purpose of the RFS is to force the oil companies to do it because they would not otherwise do it based on price because of the subsidies and the protections they have overseas that protect this industry. And so if the RFS, to speak to your last question, were repealed, we would basically lose our place on the shelf, if you will, and would not have access to the consumer that would allow these financing mechanisms to go, and we would lose these projects overseas. DuPont, Enerchem, Abengoa, some of the companies that I mentioned have all built their second plant overseas in places like China, Brazil, and France over the last 6 months. So we've already lost second plants. I think the goal now is to get the third, fourth, fifth plants back in the United States.
Thank you, and my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank the ranking member, and Chairman Loudermilk is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quickly, Mr. Coleman, what's your profession? What's your education, your profession?
I'm educated at Wesleyan University. I was educated at Northeastern School of Law. I run the Advanced Biofuels Business Council and represent the lowest carbon fuel companies in the world.
Okay, and so you're an attorney?
Yes.
Is that, okay. And you work for the,
Advanced Biofuels Business Council.
okay, the Business Council?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dr. DeCicco, your profession? You're a mechanical engineer, and who do you work for?
I work for the University of Michigan at the Energy Institute.
Before I go into questions, is there anything you would like to respond to the claims that Mr. Coleman has said?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity. You know, science is never static. It moves, we learn things as time goes on. I hate to admit this, but in the mid-1990s, I was the author of the first academic paper to call for the use of life cycle analysis in regulation as an incentive to produce advanced biofuels, cellulosic fuels in particular. And it was based on the early studies that are the precursors and set the template for all the government models now in use. I didn't know then what I have since learned about the realities of the carbon cycle, and what I realized several years ago as I began picking apart the models and trying to understand, okay, why is there so much controversy here that never seems to get resolved, is that the government models, the GREET model, which has been the basis for so many of these claims, effectively violate the law of conservation of mass. They effectively, in the computer, create carbon for the sake of offsetting the carbon out of the tailpipe without bothering to check whether additional carbon has been removed from the atmosphere. Now, Mr. Coleman says, well, I'm raising some unproven theory about additionality. Additionality, you know, the need for additional carbon is just another word for the conservation of mass. There's no such thing as free carbon. Carbon is the fuel of life. You know, we have to be careful when we say willy-nilly, we need to decarbonize the economy. I personally don't want to be decarbonized, and I don't think any of us do. our whole food chain and the whole carbon cycle by which plants at the base of the food chain take carbon from the air and utilize it to feed everything else is what's going on here. And if you take that, this is what I meant by you can't rob Peter to pay Paul. If you just take that carbon, it has to be made up somewhere else. So I am in a situation of someone kind of saying, well, the emperor has no clothes, because the emperor in this case is the Department of Energy and its models that became the template for the RFS, and EPA's models, which it did its own modeling using a similar format, the same with the California Air Resources Board. And here I am coming along and saying, oops, you guys got it wrong. Your models violate conservation of mass. You haven't checked whether that carbon that you're crediting automatically against the tailpipe was actually additional carbon in the sense that it came out of the air without stealing from the food or feed system. So I certainly realize that my criticism of these biofuel policies does fly in the face of piles of publications, but unfortunately, those publications got it wrong.
Thank you. One quick question. I'm trying to get my hands around this carbon neutrality theory. In layman's terms, the idea, the model was based on is we're going to grow more corn plants. Plants absorb carbon output. So therefore, the increased output by burning ethanol or producing ethanol will be absorbed by the increased production of corn plants. Is that a fair summary of the idea?
Oh.
And are we growing more plants to absorb?
We're growing a bit more. The key word that you said here is more. You know, in other words, if we had a barren piece of desert and then irrigated it, fertilized it, grew corn on it, then that piece of desert would be growing more corn in a way that takes more carbon out of the air than was previously being taken out. And then you could legitimately claim that that carbon in that corn feedstock offsets the emissions when the ethanol is burned. But I'm not aware that we're getting most of our corn from land that used to be barren deserts.
So it was used for other purposes. Okay.
That's right.
I say I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I think the world is turned upside down when we have the business community advocating for more government regulation and the environmental community advocating for not. So this is very interesting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And real quick, just a point of privilege here, if you'll allow me, Mr. Byer. The question, I guess I'm trying to understand is, if you're replacing other crops with corn, then the carbon accounting that Dr. DeCicco is talking about would actually be more accurate than if you don't account for that, correct? Mr. Coleman?
No. So this is the way carbon accounting works and the way the Clean Air Act works or the way that any regulation works is polluter pays. You're accountable for what you do, right? And if you grow a plant to use in bioenergy that absorbs carbon more or less, a little bit, not very much, you get credit for doing that.
But if you're producing that plant, which in this case would be corn, and you're replacing another plant, then you really haven't done anything to change the accounting of the carbon removal. Am I incorrect on that?
You are incorrect, because the way agricultural markets work is you have demand. Put it this way: agriculture, they produce for price. Okay, they don't say I'm going to grow this. I'm going to grow this corn for ethanol. They produce for price, and so when you have regulations that are changing the behavior amongst farmers, what you want in that industry is accountability for what you do, right? And so if you have acres where you want to do more corn this year and more wheat next year, and that corn gets used for a certain product, that's the product you should be accountable for. That is it.
Okay. I'm taking time that I don't have. So, Mr. Byer, you're recognized as the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Anderson, thank you for coming up to talk to us. And I'm sure I've eaten at many of your Wendy's over the years. Dr. Dinan talked about with the existing fuel standard that corn price or overall food prices would only rise about 0.1%, and if repealed, would fall less than 0.1%. With some excellent research, we found that the price of corn per bushel was $3.77 when President Bush signed the law in December of '07. It's $3.68 per bushel right now, 9 cents cheaper. So how do you get $34,000 in increased food prices directly related to RFS in your stores?
PricewaterhouseCoopers did the study in 2012, and then based on that process, determined that the impact was the $34,000.
If you look at the USDA, you also see that the price was up at $6.60 or something in 2012 when they did that study. So now we're back down to $3.68. So my guess is if PwC that the study again, you'd find literally no impact on your business.
Literally no impact would be incorrect. Our prices are still up, and I would say also that we had 2 record corn crops, and this year we're going to be followed by an almost record corn crop. I think it's highly unlikely that we will continue to have record corn crops to keep the price of corn at that.
And Mr. Mayor, not to disagree with you at all, it may well be true, but I think we need to isolate increase in your food costs from the price of corn. They may not be one-to-one.
I would respectfully disagree with that.
Okay, good. Mr. Coleman, what about Brazil? Mr. Drevna talked all about shipping ethanol from California there and bringing sugarcane back.
Yeah, Mr. Drevna is talking about a different program when he talks about the low carbon fuel standard in California. That program drives the lowest carbon fuel. It does not have respect for state or country borders, and if you have a low carbon fuel, California wants to show that there's a market for it. So Brazil is shipping sugar ethanol to that marketplace. In terms of the RFS, so Brazilian ethanol does hit the advanced biofuel requirement. 90+% of the fuel used under this program, however, has been U.S. produced. The point of the RFS is to drive plant production and new industries in this country. We have 210 ethanol plants alone. We have another 60,000 jobs and hundreds of biodiesel plants in this country alone, and now we're getting that first wave of cellulosic plants that creates value-added agriculture. And so we're really seeing tremendous benefit inside the United States.
Great, thank you. Dr. DeCicco, I want to give you one more chance to try to help me explain this carbon neutrality. When we look at the fossil fuels, that was carbon taken out of the air millions and millions of years ago and now burned. So we're taking carbon that's been stored for these millions of years and putting it back into the atmosphere, putting it into the ocean. When you talk to cellulosics, you're taking carbon that was taken out of the atmosphere last year or this year and putting it back in. Why isn't that just on the surface of it? By the way, if I recall my physics, the first law of thermodynamics is the conservation of mass and energy. Because they're interchangeable, E equals mc squared. So if we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere now to burn to put back in, why is that just on the surface of it, not much less net carbon than burning something that was taken out millions of years ago?
Well, the thing to keep in mind is to neutralize those emissions, the way you're saying, is that you need to come up with more carbon than was already being taken out of the air. Now that can happen. So let me turn to an example. I think, this DuPont, new DuPont facility that was
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
Why more carbon? If you just take the same carbon that was coming out anyway, so get rid of this alternative land use theory. It was going to come out in soy crops or forest or whatever. No, leave the desertite. You're still putting carbon back into the atmosphere that was coming out naturally rather than carbon that's been stored.
Well, that's the rub here. In other words, if you have corn that already removed carbon from the atmosphere, it's quite true that that corn was already being digested, and calories burned results in CO2 being exhaled. If you take it and use it for fuel, that carbon still comes out of the air, so in the tailpipe. So the question then becomes, as I said before, does that mean that that calorie consumption, the corn that was being consumed by people and livestock, has disappeared? And the answer is no, it's certainly not disappeared. And this is, again, why it is, the conservation of mass, and yes, mass and energy, we are fortunately dealing with non-relativistic velocities in the commodity markets, that you can't just assume that because the carbon was recently grown, that it's sufficient to balance out the system, which is using huge volumes of carbon already for food and feed. And that's the essence of how I have essentially picked apart and found the flaws in the life cycle models.
I'd like to thank the ranking member. Recognize Mr. Weber from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Doctor, is it Dinan? They've been ignoring you. And so I just wanted to come to you. I'm going to have a question for all 5 of you, and it's simple yes or no, and I don't want you to give away the answer. Just do you know the answer? MTBE. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson, since you run some Wendy's franchises, you may or may not know what that is.
No, sir.
Okay. And is it Dr. DeCicco? Okay.
Yes, I know what MTBE is.
Mr. Coleman?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it, yes.
Okay, Dr. Drevna? Okay. So this is a push to do away with MTBE, aka methyl tert-butyl ether, as I understand it. Ostensibly because MTBE was found in groundwater. Is that right? Any of y'all? All of you, Dr. Drevna?
MTBE was found in groundwater because we had a leaking underground storage tank debacle in the country. And EPA passed a regulation that gave underground storage tanks 10 years to comply. But then our RFG renewable RFG2 came into play. And we had to put more of an oxygenate into the gasoline.
Okay. Do we know what effect ethanol has in groundwater?
If you have a leaking underground storage tank, by what I've seen in the studies, would indicate that the ethanol will separate out first from the water, whereas the bacteria would go after the BTEX compounds, benzene, toluene, xylene, in the underground water, and the MTBE would traverse further. The bacteria likes their cocktails before dinner, so they go for the ethanol first. But in essence, I think we fixed the underground storage tank problem in the country, which was the root of the problem.
So according to Wikipedia, stand by, Mr. Coleman, I'll come to you.
Okay.
MTBE was not very soluble in water.
It was very soluble in water.
It's very soluble
Yes,
in water.
yes.
Okay.
So is ethanol.
And so ethanol is, but you said it separates out quicker.
No, what happens? Ethanol has an affinity for water.
Okay.
That's why when one of the previous witnesses talked, or maybe it was Mr. Chairman, talked about the outdoor power equipment and the marine people. The marine folks don't like a lot of ethanol, if at all, in use in marine equipment, because the ethanol will separate out. And
That's because it's corrosive to the inside of a steel engine. Is that correct?
Well, it's corrosive to certain pumps and flanges and hoses and things.
Okay.
But again, the reason for the marine folks who don't want it is because ethanol has an affinity for water.
Okay, Mr. Coleman, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, just a quick thought. When MTBE went in gasoline, we had a massive drinking water problem because MTBE was highly soluble in water, and it actually extended the plume into drinking water aquifers. When we replaced MTBE with ethanol, we no longer had that problem. And Mr. Drevna's view is that all of a sudden the underground storage tanks were fixed. Our view is that it's a better biodegradable product.
Okay.
And then I'll yield on the second part.
Mr. Brennan, you had another question, or Dr.
Yeah, I have a comment on that, and about some of the things that my colleague here, Mr. Coleman, has been talking about, a free market. MTBE, the RFG2 was a free market. The ethanol folks clamored because the consumer didn't want ethanol. The consumer still doesn't want it. in massive quantities.
Well, we've had another, in a committee that I chair, the Energy Subcommittee, we've had a group of gas station owned by farmers in Ohio area, I think, or maybe it was Iowa, I'd have to go back and look, who actually couldn't sell enough of this stuff in the very heart of corn country. So from an economic standpoint, it just wasn't really flying.
Mr. Weber, could I just add one quick comment?
Sure.
Because he's attacking our industry. So I know.
Wait, now, if we have a difference of opinion, that's not an attack, right?
No, yeah. But the record is open for 2 weeks. We would be happy to provide further information about the demand.
So you'd be
for-
happy to counterattack?
Perhaps counter-argue.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I'm going to leave it at that, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield back.
Thank you. I guess we are out of witnesses on that end. So we'll go with Mr. Babin, also from Texas.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. Maybe I missed this a while ago, but Dr. DeCicco, can you tell me a little more about why corn ethanol is worse for air quality than gasoline? That may have already been asked and hashed, but
Sure. I'd be happy to explain that. In particular, the part of the air quality that I'm focusing on is the CO2 emissions, because that's the emissions that the ethanol proponents claim that would be reduced by the use of ethanol. When it comes right down to it, it's a matter of chemistry. For the fuel, carbon, as I said, is the fuel of life, and it provides energy both to people through calories, and we can also use carbon-based fuels to provide energy for cars and trucks and airplanes. And it's a great energy carrier. So ethanol is a carbon-based fuel, and that is somewhat compatible with gasoline, although, as we've heard, there's limits and problems associated with putting too much of it into the gasoline. But when you burn ethanol, the combustion still creates CO2 coming out of the tailpipe. Same for biodiesel. And so a short way of thinking about it is that if biofuels were to have a benefit for CO2, it's not when they're burned. I mean, when you burn it, you have to burn that carbon, CO2 comes out of the tailpipe. So then you have to ask, okay, well, if the reduction of CO2 does not occur at the tailpipe, where might it occur? And this is where you have to go back and say, well, did we remove more CO2 when we harvested the feedstock than plants were already absorbing from the air? And if you haven't done that, and in the vast majority of biofuel that we grow, we're growing it on existing cropland, sourcing the corn and soybeans from existing cropland. You've not removed more CO2 from the air. Now, yields have gone up a little bit. My analysis accounts for that. But that's just a small increase in the removal. But the bottom line is, because there's no benefit to the atmosphere when the biofuel is burned, unless you pull more CO2 out of the air, which you might do by harvesting corn stover residues, so there's a potential there to get a benefit that way. But unless you do something like that, if all you do is divert existing crop production into the fuel market, then right off the bat, there's no benefit. And as I said before, then you have to add in all those excess emissions associated with processing the fuel, and the picture starts to look very bad very soon.
okay, thank you. And should corn ethanol be classified as a green fuel then, given this environmental impact?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Okay. And now the administration has proposed lowering the ozone standard, ambient air quality, to 70 parts per billion. In your opinion, would the RFS complicate efforts to attain a more stringent standard, if that's the case?
Yes, it could. As you move into sort of the various parts of the low blend realm, you can worsen evaporative emissions from ethanol. I wouldn't want to say that it's a large effect, but it's an aggravating effect.
But if you couple that with higher food prices and the other negatives of the ethanol industry, it certainly could have a detrimental effect, right?
Well, I'm sticking kind of myself on the environmental side here. I know there's different views
Right.
on the food
Okay.
price impacts.
Okay, I was just thinking. And Dr. Dinan, what is your assessment of the impact of the RFS on blending of biofuels into the transportation fuel supply? And has the use of biofuels increased because of the RFS? Or would we have seen ethanol production grow without a federal mandate? It's a three-part question.
Okay. Well, we really don't actually answer the question, did corn ethanol use grow because of the RFS? What our analysis is really about looking forward. So what we do look at is whether or not the use of corn ethanol would decline very much if we had a repeal of the law. And we indicate that we don't think it would decline that much because there are other benefits that blenders receive by blending in the corn ethanol. It helps them with octane requirements and with meeting carbon monoxide emission reductions requirements. So that's why we don't find a big drop in corn ethanol use. But if the law was to push the amount of corn ethanol, of total renewable fuels, up to the levels required under the law, ISA, rather than the amount proposed by EPA, then there would be a significant problem with the blend wall.
Okay, thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. So if we're blending 10% now, if we were to repeal the RFS, we would still be blending what, according to your study?
We think it would stay at roughly 10% for at least
So
several
the
years
idea
to
that we're
come.
going to ruin all these jobs and destroy these markets, that's incorrect?
Well, what we say is that there's a tension between keeping the costs down and pushing the technology. So if you were to repeal the RFS, you would reduce incentives to create more E85 stations, and also for production facilities for more advanced biofuels.
Okay. The gentleman, Mr. Abraham, is recognized from Louisiana.
Dr. Coleman, I see you on the button. Give me your opinion. If we repealed the RSF, what would that do to general farm prices right now? They're low already, the commodity prices. What would the total repeal of the RFS do to the?
That's a question for,
Yes, sir.
for myself.
That's how you wanted to answer.
Yeah, sure. Well, if you repeal the RFS, you're taking away a value-added agriculture market for the agricultural community. And so I think the fundamental premise of the RFS is that we have enough corn and we have as many farms and as much agricultural product to do more than just one thing, and that's to feed animals, that we can make bioplastics out of them, we can make fuel, we can make a number of different things. If you ask the agricultural community, they don't feel like they should be in the box of only producing food, and I think low corn prices today bear that out. And so what you would have is a situation where repealing the RFS would create more economic pain in the heartland, and that is not something that we want to see. In terms of clarifying the jobs part of this, I represent the advanced biofuels industry, and I think what's at stake here, even though the debate that the oil industry tries to have this conversation around is about corn ethanol, what's at stake is the advanced biofuels part of the RFS. And so if the thesis is that we're not going to lose corn ethanol by repealing the RFS, my feeling isn't that what we're talking about? We're talking about innovation here.
All right, let me go back to you first, Dr. Coleman. In view that we have RFS standards now, what's your opinion? Why are corn prices so low now?
Couple of reasons. The first is that we have plenty of supply against demand. And so we've come back to a situation where after a couple years of drought, which drove corn prices up, we are now in a healthy corn market and even an oversupplied corn market where we have so much supply that it's driving prices down. The second reason is if you look at the correlation analysis of corn prices and oil prices, you will see very, very strong correlation because oil is a primary input for agricultural commodity production, and also it is a huge driver in terms of futures trading, et cetera. So you see corn and oil matching together, and anytime you have oil prices coming down, you almost always have agricultural commodity prices coming down, and so with lower oil prices, you have lower corn prices.
And Dr. Dinan had said that in her testimony that the CBO report mentioned that the fuel and food prices depend on a number of factors outside of the RFS. You agree with that statement, Mr. Coleman?
Yes, I mean, oil is the primary driver, and I should note about the CBO report, and this, I believe the doctor did not set the program confines, but it did not analyze the economic benefits of reducing petroleum dependence in that report, and that's a little bit like looking at the economic benefits of a jobs program and not looking at the economic benefits of jobs creation. And so we have a problem with that report, and we think that needs to be fixed. So I think if you look at the actual central point of the RFS, which is to reduce petroleum dependence, if we add that into the equation, the economic benefits of the RFS would be astounding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Westerman from Arkansas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses for being here today. These are some fascinating subjects, and I'm struggling a little bit on which one to address here. We've got land use and a clean environment. We've got the law of conservation of mass and energy conservation or net energy gain or the carbon cycle and economics versus of real versus inflationary food cost. These are all things that I like to talk about, but let's start off with the carbon cycle and land use. And Dr. DeCicco, if I understand your argument that and getting back to the law of conservation of mass and energy, there's only so much carbon in the world, and the question is, where's that carbon going to be located? It's either going to be in the atmosphere, or it's going to be sequestered somewhere under the ground or in biomass here on the Earth. And if we create a new crop source to make ethanol or corn, then you're going to be clearing more land to produce this corn. So you're changing land use and putting a crop there that's going to be planted and harvested every year. I remember being at a conference on renewable energy where they were showing in South America where they had cleared this highly productive land to grow, I don't remember if it was sugar beets or corn, but in the photo there was timber from a rainforest stacked up in a perimeter around the land. It was used to keep animals out of the crop. But as we look at that, something we haven't talked about is the energy gain from corn ethanol. And the research that I've looked at shows it somewhere between 1 to 1.3, maybe as high as 1.6 on the energy put into producing corn ethanol versus the energy that you get out. We've been talking more about the carbon balance on it. But if we look at other forms of cellulosic ethanol or biomass, even though the processes haven't been refined, the numbers on the net energy gain are much higher than what we see on corn ethanol. So are you saying we should totally abandon all renewable fuels, or is there room for more research to develop some of these cellulosic ethanol technologies, maybe from woody biomass, that do have even a better carbon cycle effect?
Sure. I take issue with the mandating of the fuels from an environmental point of view. I think it's important to support the research. So in other words, as I've pointed out, there is a potential, if it's done right, if technology materializes in an economically viable way at commercial scale for forms of cellulosic production, in a way that has failed to materialize for nearly 40 years now. I mean, this is not a new area of research. Then that could be a good thing, provided the land use is properly managed and that there are guarantees that the actual production of whatever biomass is going to be going into the cellulosic fuel is done in such a way that it increases the rate at which carbon is removed from the atmosphere without depriving the food and feed system of carbon. So there's two big ifs that have not been met, are not, in my estimation, close to being met for the commercial viability of so-called advanced biofuels. So yes, you know, in terms of this committee's role in advising the research programs, we should continue research in this area and maybe make you know, progress through that. But when it comes to intervening in the marketplace and trying to force fuels in that are not commercially viable, that have a dubious carbon pedigree anyway because the analyses backing them were done incorrectly, I think that you know, is very questionable.
If we look
to do that
at our
man-made.
forest across the country right now, we see hundreds of millions of tons of carbon going up in smoke every year from forests that are mismanaged. And if that carbon were captured and used for energy, it seems to me like there would be a net benefit from energy and the carbon cycle to do that.
That's correct. I mean, that's an example where if you're capturing carbon, harvesting carbon, say from forest residues that are at risk of causing a fire and burning up anyway, or corn stover to the extent you can do that without overly degrading your soils, that would decay anyway, release its carbon. Those are examples of what I mean by additional carbon. You know, you're getting additional carbon because you're taking carbon that otherwise would either burn or decay without being put to commercial use. So those are potentially legitimate sources of carbon, but I don't think that that then justifies some kind of mandatory use. I think you need to look at that situation carefully, and then I would go back to, we need to have the right market signals here involved, and that's not something you get through a technology winner picking mandate.
And I think I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, but if you'll oblige me just a few minutes, are we going to get a second round of questions?
I'll give you another minute.
All right, thank you. So as we look at where we're at on cellulosic fuels, it seems to me it would make sense that while conventional energy prices are low, that we've put more money into research to make these cellulosic fuels competitive in a free market, so that when conventional fuel costs go up, we could use these renewable fuels in a market-based economy, so that we're not subsidizing or mandating the use of them. But we just don't have the technology yet to make them cost effectively to do that. Would you agree with that? Mr. Coleman, your finger's on the button.
Yeah, that's the industry I represent. And so, you know, I think I've made myself clear on this whole idea of a price-driven marketplace that we don't have. If you look at the history of ethanol use in this country, about 90% of the last 10 years, ethanol has been vastly cheaper than gasoline, and the oil industry hasn't used more than it has been required by the government to use. If we had a price-driven marketplace, we would already have the things that we're talking about wanting now: consumer choice at the pump, an alternative to gasoline, hedges against pump price spikes associated with petroleum, et cetera. The second thing I would take issue with is this cost component of cellulosic. If you look at how much, we're at the end of the era of light sweet crude that just squirts out of the ground. We are at the deep water, fracking, tight oil part of the evolution of crude oil that is infinitely more expensive than light sweet crude. And if you look at the costs of cellulosic biofuel versus the marginal oil gallon, such as the money that was spent in the Bakken, we are cost competitive with those oil plays. And so what we need to drive competition in the marketplace is access to the marketplace that we are not going to get unless we have either the RFS or we break up the oil companies, which I don't think is very politically popular.
Yeah, and you know, most consumers, I think, care about what the price is on the gas pump. However, it gets there. Mr. Drevna, would you like to address that?
I don't know where to start. I just can't believe what I just heard in this hearing room. First of all, there's still, as the doctor said at the end of the table said, there's still a 10% maximum blend wall you can't meet. And that automobile or that lawnmower or that chainsaw doesn't give anything about where that ethanol comes from, whether it's cellulosic or whether it's corn or whether it's some steel in West Virginia. It's ethanol. And we have a blend wall. Even EPA, who I very rarely agree with, says there's a blend wall problem, and it will be for the distant future. Number two, Mr. Coleman keeps on talking about this grand conspiracy of the big oil trying to stop penetration into the market. Well, I mean, the reality of the situation is big oil, little oil, independent refiner in the middle of the Corn Belt. They do not control anything to do with the market. 95% of the retail market is controlled by independent operators, just as my colleague down here, Mr. Anderson, is an independent operator for a franchise. It's the same thing. If those franchisees want to sell more ethanol or want to put in E85 pumps, have at it. If my friends from the advanced biofuel or the corn ethanol folks want to invest rather than sup at the government trough year in and year out, they can put the money. They can talk to the owners of the gas stations and say, hey, we're going to invest with you because it's got to be, it's not oil versus advanced versus this, it's what the consumer wants.
I would like to say how much I've enjoyed this exchange between Mr. Coleman and Mr. Drevna, but in the interest of the folks on the committee, we're going to go to our next questioner.
Thank you for that extended minute, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, you bet. Mr. LaHood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman and Chairman Loudermilk, I look forward to working with you on this issue and appreciate the testimony of the witnesses here today. I'm brand new, come from Illinois, which is ag is the #1 industry in our state. And in hearing the testimony, particularly from Dr. DeCicco and Mr. Drevna, I mean, it really seems incongruent when you look at the genesis of the law. In going back and looking at the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and the ESA law of 2007, and at the signing ceremony there, or the emphasis on why that was put in place, the RFS, you know, President Bush talked about protecting the environment, strengthening our energy security, supporting American farmers. And you listen to that, and also the Secretary of Energy at the time, Samuel Bodman, and Secretary Joe Hans, who's now a U.S. Senator, and you listen to what they said then and how that's played out, and then you hear the testimony here today. They're in conflict, and I'm trying to rationalize that and figure out where the truth lies. And I guess in looking at my own district, I have a very rural district in central and west central Illinois. And I think in my district, ag is the #1 industry in the state of Illinois. We have, we have some of the most fertile farmland in the entire world. And I look at what it does in Illinois in terms of what it's done for our consumers. I don't, to be honest with you, Mr. Anderson, I don't hear much complaints about food prices going up in my district. We have some big livestock operations there. We have some of the highest yields we've had. Energy prices and gasoline prices have been low in Illinois, and then our air pollution has gone down almost every year in Illinois. And so I look at those tangible benefits, and I also look at the jobs that are created in Illinois through agriculture, whether that's John Deere or ADM or Caterpillar, or lots of small and medium-sized businesses that have benefited from this law. And I guess in looking at, Dr. DeCicco, the flaws that you laid out, and I have to admit, I don't know much about carbon neutrality or violation of carbon mass, some of these flaws, but I guess in looking at the genesis of this bill and what was put forward and the rationale and how that's playing out, I guess I have not heard from, whether it's Secretary Bodman or Secretary Joe Hans, on acknowledging these flaws or making statements that the law somehow was incorrect and we need to amend that or revise that. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I think as you pointed out, at the time that the law was passed, and especially when ISA greatly expanded the renewable fuel mandate, there were really sort of three public policy rationales. You can kind of think of them as a three-legged stool that propped up this expansive requirement for renewable fuels. And as you point out, one is rural economy. And I'm certainly not going to question that. I mean, I don't think there's a doubt that creating additional demand for grains and other farm commodities is going to help those economies. Then there's the energy security rationale. Well, I think these commodity markets respond slowly, especially the oil market, and I think we've seen a lot more energy security come from increased petroleum than we have from the relatively small and relatively costly biofuel. So I'm not so sure about that second leg. The environmental leg, in spite of, I think, good intentions and Department of Energy sponsored analyses and so on, that has not stood the test of time scientifically. I mean, I would have to say, the way I look at my analysis is I've essentially cut off that environmental leg. So whether the RFS can stand on a rural economic development leg and perhaps an energy security leg that I'll kind of let others debate, it is certainly no longer an environmental rationale for a mandate like this.
I would just follow up on that. So in looking at those flaws that you laid out and what you mentioned, I mean, are you aware of, for instance, Secretary Bodman, who is a chemical engineer from MIT, that he has acknowledged those flaws or put anything on record to say that this was done inappropriately or the wrong way?
I'm not aware of that. I mean, I do acknowledge that the criticisms, environmental criticisms that have come to the fore in this policy in terms of the scientific literature are relatively recent. We know more now than we did some time ago. I would say, and I'm happy to put this in the record, in 2002, I was at the Environmental Defense Fund and co-authored a brief position statement on the prospect of a mandate. And myself and the other colleague there, Tim Searchinger, now at Princeton University, we raised red flags. Not all the science was in place for me at that time to be able to give as strong a criticism on the environment as I'm able to do today. But we were certainly concerned and wary of the risks at that time. Unfortunately, it's taking some time for that to be assimilated, digested by a lot of people at the Department of Energy and elsewhere who have been guided by analyses that we now know were incorrect.
Well, and the last thing I would say, Mr. Chairman, is, I've tried to find evidence either from, Secretary Bodman or the EPA director at the time, Stephen Johnson, or from President Bush that somehow this was a flawed law and was not done the right way, and I've had difficulty finding that evidence. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Byer has been listening patiently to my side of the aisle for the better half of probably 30 minutes. So I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes, and then I'll close it out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with due deference to the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Environment being from Oklahoma, I'd like to cite a study from the University of Tulsa National Energy Policy Institute that estimated that the U.S. has spent $8 trillion from 1976 through 2010 defending access to oil supplies in the Persian Gulf. So, Mr. Coleman, a rhetorical question. Is the massive cost that U.S. taxpayers pay every year to defend these shipping lanes included in the price of oil?
No, it's not, and it's because we pay for it as taxpayers. And so this is part of the reason that this whole notion of let the market decide, which is probably the proper notion to have in 90% of the markets in this country, doesn't work for motor fuels. And so if the oil industry had to pay for getting itself through the Straits of Hormuz, the cost of gasoline would be much higher. But right now the taxpayer pays for it. And the oil industry also, and I will point out with regard to the Bakken and tight oil, one of the biggest leaseholders in the Bakken testified before Senate Finance in 2012 that the only reason that they were successful there is because of the tax subsidies that allowed them to keep their money and reinvest it. And so when it comes to energy security, I think the government is properly engaged because it matters that we have enough energy to get to work and go to the grocery store, and the government should stay engaged. But this idea that the RFS is somehow distorting a free market is just not a serious allegation.
And as we talked about, the great promise of advanced biofuels rather than simple corn ethanol. If we do away with the renewable fuel standards and that first generation ethanol plants goes away, what implications does that have for being able to develop an advanced biofuels market?
Well, if you look at renewables writ large, so whether it's wind, solar, or any innovation product, you will find that revenues created by first gen get poured into innovation in second generation. So first, the windmill companies that build the big windmills are the ones financing smaller windmills and distributed energy. Same for solar, same for geothermal, et cetera, et cetera. In our industry, that is starkly clear. So if you look at the first movers in cellulosic ethanol, you will see Abengoa, you will see Poet DSM, you will see DuPont, you will see Quad County. Those are all first-gen corn ethanol companies who are taking revenue streams from the selling of corn ethanol. And because the RFS sends a clear signal to diversify feedstock and innovate, they are doing that. And so a lot of this discussion about corn ethanol is really a distraction. The RFS stops requiring corn ethanol this year. It flatlines over time. It is a stalking horse for incumbents to come after the advanced biofuels industry, and that is the largest part of the RFS going forward, 90+% of the RFS going forward. So if we repeal it or even change of law, which scares investors, we will be in a situation where we continue to build these next generation plants overseas, and that would be a huge opportunity lost.
Great, great. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you very much.
You bet. You mentioned Tulsa University, and you mentioned what we do in the United States Navy, of which I spent many years of my life. I would just like to let the record show that if terrorists or rogue nations wanted to take control of the corn market, we would defend the corn market as well. Mr. Drevna, did you have a thought on that issue? I saw you.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. This whole thing, you know, and Mr. Coleman's right. And he used the right term too. He said the corn ethanol flatlines after this year, 15, some billion gallons. The problem is that the ESA 07 calls for 36 billion gallons of phantom fuel, or 22 billion of which are phantom fuels by 2022. What are we going to do? What's the refining industry? What are the obligated parties going to do between now and 2022? When, if you look at the success failure rate of these advanced biofuels, there's as I said in my testimony, if it weren't for EPA to change a scientific definition, and you look at the testimony, the production from these facilities is minuscule, and it's going to be minuscule. So are we supposed to say, well, it's right around the corner, so you obligated parties keep sending money to the federal government and buying tax credits to keep this industry going? Or do you want to let investors invest in this stuff, just like every other entrepreneur in this country has done forever, and make a better product and take the risk rather than having being propped up by the government and then having the taxpayer end up paying for it? That's the choice you have to make. I appreciate the ability to respond.
Absolutely. So in summary, what I learned, the renewable fuel standard is damaging to the environment, which was new to me, by the way, in this hearing, and it actually increases carbon emissions. Food prices have been increased, although there's some debate about that, but I think on average it will go up a little bit, which makes the standard of living for all Americans a little bit harder to achieve. And repealing the renewable fuel standard would not get rid of jobs. I do believe that there may be a place for the government to be involved in research and development for advanced biofuels, but creating a mandate is not the right solution. With that, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, absolutely. Good work.